Welcome everyone. Tonight we're stepping onto the grounds of academia, a place of learning, growth, and for some, unimaginable terror. College is often remembered as the best years of one's life, filled with new friendships and late-night study sessions. But beneath the surface of bustling campuses and ivy-covered walls, a darker side sometimes emerges. I have for you tonight 4 allegedly true stories from students who found themselves living through experiences that defy rational explanation, tales that turn their dorm rooms and libraries into scenes from their worst nightmares. I must warn you, what you're about to hear is deeply unsettling. These stories are not for the faint of heart. They deal with the kind of fear that lingers long after the lights are turned back on, the kind that makes you second-guess that strange noise down the hall, or the fleeting shadow you thought you saw in your periphery. So, I invite you to find a quiet place, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the shadows of college life, where the pursuit of knowledge can sometimes lead to terrifying discoveries. The events described in the following stories are said to have actually happened. They've been submitted by viewers like you, who needed to share the burden of their horrifying encounters. We'll explore the unnerving feeling of a presence in a supposedly empty dorm room, the creeping dread of being watched by an unseen predator, the maddening persistence of a knock in the dead of night, and the chilling mystery of a person who simply vanishes into thin air. Let's begin. Our first story comes from a student named Maya. Her freshman year was supposed to be a fresh start, an exciting new chapter. She was assigned a single dorm room in one of the oldest buildings on campus, a Gothic-style structure named Blackwood Hall. At first, she loved the solitude. It was her own personal space, a sanctuary for late-night studying and quiet reflection. The first week was uneventful, filled with the typical chaos of orientation and making new friends. But as she settled in, a subtle wrongness began to creep into her new home. It started with small things, easily dismissed. A textbook she was certain she left on her desk would be found on the floor. The closet door, which she always kept firmly shut, would be slightly ajar in the morning. Maya brushed it off as her own forgetfulness, the stress of a new environment playing tricks on her mind. She was tired, overworked, and probably just not paying as much attention as she thought. It was easier to believe that than to consider any other alternative. Then came the noises. At first it was a faint scratching sound, seeming to come from within the walls. She told herself it was just mice or the old building's pipes settling, but the sound wasn't consistent like pipes contracting or the skittering of a rodent. It was methodical, rhythmic, scratch, scratch, scratch. It would start around 2 a.m., just as the last of the dorm's noise died down and she was drifting off to sleep, pulling her back into a state of anxious wakefulness. One night the scratching was louder than ever before. Frustrated and sleep-deprived, Maya banged her fist against the wall where the sound seemed to be originating. "Stop it!" she yelled into the silence of her room. To her shock, the scratching immediately ceased. A heavy silence fell over the room, so profound it felt more unnerving than the noise it replaced. For a moment she felt a sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a chilling thought. What if it wasn't pipes? What if something had heard her? The following evening, as she was trying to study, she heard a new sound. It was a soft whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It sounded like it was coming from the corner of her room, near the old, heavy curtains that covered the window. She froze, straining her ears, but heard nothing more. She tried to convince herself it was the wind, or someone talking in the hallway, but the sound had felt so close, so intimate, as if someone had leaned in and whispered right next to her ear. Her unease began to grow into genuine fear. She started sleeping with a small lamp on, the soft glow a fragile shield against the oppressive darkness. But the light didn't stop the occurrences. If anything, they seemed to become bolder. One night she was jolted awake not by a sound, but by a sudden, intense cold. The air in her room had dropped in temperature so significantly that she could see her own breath misting in front of her face, even though the radiator was still warm to the touch. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit room, searching for the source of the chill. That's when she saw it. A dark shape, taller than a person, was standing near her desk. It was a void in the dim light, a patch of complete blackness that seemed to absorb the glow from her lamp. It had no discernible features, just a solid, human-like silhouette. Maya was paralyzed by a terror so pure and absolute that she couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. She just stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The figure stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, a silent, menacing sentinel in her small room. She felt a palpable sense of malevolence radiating from it, a cold, ancient hatred that seemed to seep into her very bones, chilling her more than the air itself. Then, as slowly as it appeared, the figure began to recede. It didn't walk away or fade, it seemed to shrink in on itself, collapsing into the shadows until it was gone completely. The moment it vanished, the intense cold dissipated, and the room's temperature returned to normal. Maya sat there trembling for the rest of the night, too terrified to move, too terrified to even close her eyes for a second. The next day, she went to her resident advisor, her voice shaking as she recounted the night's events. The RA, a senior named Chris, listened patiently, his expression growing more serious with each word. He didn't dismiss her story as a nightmare or a prank. Instead, he told her that she wasn't the first person to report strange things happening in that specific room. Over the years, several students had requested transfers, citing feelings of being watched and unexplained phenomena. Chris told her a story that was passed down among the RAs. Decades ago, a student had taken their own life in that very room. The college, wanting to avoid a scandal, had covered it up. The details were murky, lost to time and rumor. But the one consistent part of the story was that the student's spirit was said to have never left. They said it was a lonely, angry presence, resentful of anyone who tried to occupy its space. Maya felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Every strange noise, every misplaced object, every whisper in the dark suddenly clicked into place. She wasn't going crazy. Her room was haunted by a tormented spirit. The knowledge didn't bring her comfort, it solidified her terror. She was sharing her sanctuary with something that did not want her there, something that had made its presence known in the most terrifying way imaginable. She spent that night in a friend's room, huddled on the floor in a sleeping bag. But even there, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. She kept seeing a tall, dark shadow in her peripheral vision, a fleeting glimpse that would vanish when she turned to look. The whispers seemed to follow her, faint and unintelligible, carried on the air when no one else was speaking. The haunting was no longer confined to her room. It had attached itself to her. Desperate, Maya began researching the history of Blackwood Hall in the university's archives. She spent hours poring over old yearbooks and campus newspapers, looking for any mention of a student death in the 1950s, the supposed time of the incident. She found nothing. It was as if the college had scrubbed the records clean, just as the rumor suggested. But she did find something else, a class photo from 1958. In the back row, standing behind the other students, was a young man with dark, hollow eyes. There was an unnerving intensity in his stare, a profound sadness that seemed to leap off the page. There was no name listed for him. He was just an anonymous face in a crowd, but Maya felt an icy dread crawl up her spine as she looked at him. She recognized the shape of his silhouette. It was the same tall, slender form as the figure from her room. That night she packed her bags. She didn't officially request a transfer or explain herself to the housing office. She simply left. She called her parents and told them she was coming home, making up an excuse about not being able to handle the pressure of college. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. How could she explain that she was being haunted by a ghost she'd seen in an old photograph? She transferred to a different university the next semester, one with modern, sterile buildings, leaving Blackwood Hall and its dark secret behind. She never looked back, but even now, years later, she says she sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that she is not alone. This story was sent in by a former student named Liam. During his junior year, the university library was his second home. He was a history major. He'd spend countless hours buried in stacks of dusty books, often staying until the library's closing announcement echoed through the vast, silent halls. He loved the quiet solitude, the scent of old paper and ink. It was a place of focus, a refuge from the distractions of his shared apartment. But that refuge was about to become a source of intense, creeping dread. It began subtly, as these things often do. Liam had a favorite spot, a secluded carrel on the third floor, tucked away in a corner overlooking a quiet, tree-lined quad. He noticed that whenever he was there, a man he'd never seen before would often be sitting at a table across the aisle. The man was older, maybe in his late 40s, and didn't look like a student or a professor. He would just sit there, a single book open in front of him, though Liam never once saw him turn a page. At first, Liam paid him no mind. The library was open to the public after all. It wasn't unusual to see non-students using the space, but he started noticing a pattern. The man was only ever there when Liam was. If Liam came in the afternoon, the man would be there. If he arrived late at night, the man would already be seated at the same table, waiting. His gaze was the most unsettling part. Liam would feel a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, and when he'd glance up, he'd find the man staring at him. The man's eyes were flat and emotionless. He wouldn't quickly look away when caught, as most people would. He would just hold Liam's gaze for a few uncomfortable seconds before slowly, deliberately, looking back down at his unread book. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in Liam's stomach every time he entered the library. His sanctuary was starting to feel like a trap, and the silence he once cherished now felt heavy with unspoken threat. Liam tried to change his routine to avoid him. He started studying on different floors, choosing different carols, some in more open, populated areas. But it made no difference. Within an hour or two of settling in, he'd look up and see him. The man would be there, somewhere in his line of sight, sitting at a nearby table or browsing a shelf, always with that same blank book and that same unnerving, vacant stare. He never approached, never spoke, he just watched. The constant surveillance began to erode Liam's sense of security. He started to feel like he was being hunted. He mentioned it to his friends, but they brushed it off. "He's probably just some lonely guy," one said. "You're probably just imagining it," said another. Their dismissal made him feel isolated, foolish even. Was he just being paranoid? Was he letting his imagination, fueled by late nights and caffeine, run wild? He tried to convince himself they were right. One evening, Liam was working on a major paper and stayed until the final closing announcement. He packed his bag, his mind preoccupied with his thesis. As he walked out of the library's main entrance into the cool night air, he felt it again. That familiar, chilling sensation of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder. Standing in the shadows cast by the large oak trees near the library steps was the man. He was just standing there, motionless, watching Liam walk away. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through Liam. This was no longer confined to the library. This was real. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't dare look back again. The walk to his off-campus apartment, usually a pleasant 10-minute stroll, felt like an eternity. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car horn, made him jump. He fumbled with his keys at his apartment door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key in the lock. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it and breathing heavily as he slid the deadbolt into place. He rushed to the window that overlooked the street, peering cautiously through the blinds. For a few minutes the street was empty. He started to feel a small sense of relief, thinking maybe he had lost him. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness at the end of the block and began walking slowly, deliberately, down his street. It was him. The man didn't stop at his building, he just walked past, his head not even turning in Liam's direction. But Liam knew it was a message. He knew where Liam lived. The fear was no longer just a feeling of being watched. It was the terrifying knowledge that this unknown man, this predator, had followed him home. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the old building, every footstep on the sidewalk outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He called the campus police the next morning. He described the man, his strange behavior in the library, and the incident from the night before. The officer was sympathetic but explained that without a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't broken any laws. "Staring isn't a crime," the officer told him, though he promised to have patrols keep a closer eye on the library. The conversation left Liam feeling even more helpless and alone. He decided to avoid the library altogether, a significant blow to his studies. He tried to work in noisy coffee shops or in his cramped apartment, but his focus was shattered. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, scanning every face in a crowd, expecting to see those flat, empty eyes staring back at him. The fear had followed him out of the library and now permeated every aspect of his life. He felt like a prisoner in his own city. A week later, desperation drove him back to the library. He had a final exam that he couldn't afford to fail. He went in the middle of the day hoping the bright sunlight and larger crowd would offer some protection. He chose a table in the most central, visible part of the main reading room. For a few hours, things felt normal. He was so engrossed in his textbook that he almost forgot about the man. Almost. He got up to use the restroom. As he was washing his hands, the door creaked open. Liam glanced at the reflection in the mirror and his blood ran cold. The man was standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. This was the closest they had ever been. For the first time, Liam could see the fine lines on his face, the graying stubble on his chin, but his eyes were the same, impassive, cold, and fixed directly on Liam. Neither of them moved for what felt like a lifetime. The only sound was the drip of water from the faucet. The man finally took a slow step into the restroom, his expression unchanging. He reached into his jacket pocket. Liam's mind raced, imagining the glint of a weapon. He braced himself, his body tensing for an attack, but the man didn't pull out a knife. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slowly unfolded it and held it up for Liam to see. It was a photograph, an old, faded color photo of a young woman who looked to be about Liam's age. She was smiling, standing on the very same library steps where Liam had seen the man watching him. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was a rough, quiet rasp. "You have her eyes," he said. He then turned and walked out of the restroom, leaving Liam standing there, trembling and utterly bewildered. Liam never saw the man again. He later found an old news article online about a female student who had vanished from campus years ago. Her body was never found. The photo in the article was the same woman from the man's photograph. Our third story comes from Chloe, who experienced this during her sophomore year living in a campus apartment complex. The complex was relatively new, but it had a strange, sterile quietness to it, especially late at night. Chloe lived alone in a one-bedroom unit on the ground floor. For the first few months it was peaceful. She enjoyed the independence. That peace was shattered one Tuesday night, right around 3 a.m. She was woken from a deep sleep by a loud, insistent knocking at her front door. It wasn't a gentle tap, it was a series of 3 hard, deliberate knocks that echoed through her small apartment. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who would be knocking on her door at this hour? Maybe it was a friend in trouble, or the RA doing a late-night check for some reason. She crept out of bed, her mind racing through possibilities. She tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. The motion-activated light was off, plunging the corridor into darkness. There was no one there. Confused and a little spooked, she stood by the door, listening. She heard nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator. She dismissed it as a dream, or perhaps someone knocking on the wrong door and leaving quickly. She went back to bed, though it took her a long time to fall back asleep. The next night it happened again, 3 a.m. on the dot. 3 loud, hard knocks. This time she was ready. She jumped out of bed and ran to the door, peering through the peephole in seconds. Again, nothing. The hallway was dark and silent. It was impossible for someone to knock that hard and disappear from the peephole's view so quickly without making a sound. A cold dread began to seep into her. This wasn't a mistake. The knocking became a nightly ritual. Every single night at precisely 3 a.m. the 3 sharp knocks would jolt her from her sleep. Every night she would check the peephole to find an empty, silent hallway. The consistency was what terrified her the most. It was methodical, punctual, like a macabre clock striking the witching hour at her front door. Sleep became a source of anxiety rather than rest. She would lie awake, staring at her ceiling, dreading the inevitable sound. She started trying to outsmart whatever was doing this. One night she left her small entryway light on, hoping to catch a glimpse of a shadow under the door. But at 3 a.m. the knocks came as usual, and she saw nothing. The next night she propped a chair against the door, a flimsy barricade that offered more psychological comfort than actual security. The knocks came and the chair didn't even rattle. It was as if the sound was coming from the door itself, not from a physical impact. Her friends thought she was exaggerating or sleep-deprived. "It's probably just the building settling," one suggested. "Maybe you should get some earplugs." But Chloe knew this was different. This wasn't a random creak or groan of a building. It was intentional. It felt personal. The sound was so clear, so solid, it felt like someone was standing right on her doorstep, demanding to be let in. Desperate for an answer, she decided to stay up one night and record it. She sat on her couch, her phone's video camera pointed at the door, and waited. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 2:58, 2:59. As the clock on her phone turned to 3 o'clock a.m., the knocks came, right on cue. Loud, sharp, and clear on the recording, but as she stared at her phone screen, replaying the video, her blood ran cold. The video had captured the sound perfectly, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no shadow, just her door, perfectly still. The next day she showed the recording to her RA. He listened, his brow furrowed. He admitted it was strange, but suggested it could be a prank by someone in a neighboring apartment. He promised to send out an email to the residents on her floor, reminding them of quiet hours. Chloe knew it wasn't a prank. A prankster would eventually give up or get caught. This was something else, something persistent and inexplicable. The knocking didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to get more aggressive. Sometimes it would be followed by a faint scratching sound. as if fingernails were being dragged slowly down the wood of the door. Chloe's mental state began to deteriorate. She was perpetually exhausted, jumpy, and paranoid. She started barricading her door every night with her desk, a dresser, anything heavy she could move. She felt like she was under siege. One night, driven by a mixture of terror and frustration, she decided to confront it. As 3 a.m. approached, she stood by the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. The 3 knocks came, louder and more forceful than ever before. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled bravery, or perhaps foolishness, she yelled, "Who's there? What do you want?" The only response was a chilling silence, but this time the silence felt different. It felt charged, expectant. She held her breath, listening, and then she heard it. A low, guttural whisper, right on the other side of the door. The voice was raspy and inhuman. It spoke a single word, a word that would be burned into her memory forever. It said, "In." Chloe stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. She scrambled for her phone and called campus security, babbling hysterically about someone trying to break into her apartment. An officer arrived within minutes. He checked the hallway, the surrounding area, and found nothing. There were no signs of attempted forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The officer looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The next day, Chloe broke her housing contract. She paid the fine without a second thought. She couldn't spend another night in that apartment. She moved back home with her parents for the rest of the semester, commuting over an hour each way. She never told them the real reason she left her apartment. How could she explain that she was being tormented by a disembodied knock and a single terrifying word whispered through her door? Years have passed and Chloe now lives in a high-rise apartment building in a busy city, but she says the fear has never completely left her. She still has a deep-seated aversion to front doors, and sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city outside is quiet, she thinks she can hear a faint distant knocking, 3 sharp raps, a ghostly echo from her past reminding her of the time something sinister came knocking, wanting to be let in. Our final story tonight is about a young man named Alex and his roommate, a quiet, enigmatic student named Julian. They were randomly assigned to share a dorm room during their freshman year. From the beginning, Julian was an oddity. He was intensely private, speaking only when absolutely necessary. He had no posters on his walls, no personal photos on his desk. His side of the room was as sterile and impersonal as a hotel room. Alex tried to be friendly, inviting Julian to hang out with his new friends or grab a meal at the dining hall, but Julian always politely declined. He spent most of his time in the room, either reading obscure philosophy books or staring at his laptop screen for hours on end, though Alex could never see what he was working on. He seemed to exist in his own separate world, a world to which Alex was not granted access. Despite his strangeness, Julian was a model roommate in many ways. He was quiet, neat, and respectful of Alex's space. They fell into a silent routine. Alex would go to classes, hang out with friends, and come back late, often to find Julian already asleep or engrossed in his silent activities. Life went on like this for the first 2 months of the semester, an arrangement of peaceful, if slightly unsettling, coexistence. Then, one Monday morning, Alex woke up to find Julian's side of the room empty. His bed was neatly made, but his backpack, laptop, and textbooks were gone. Alex figured he had just left early for class. He didn't think much of it. He went about his day attending his own lectures and study groups. When he returned to the room that evening, however, Julian still wasn't there. His bed remained untouched. This was unusual. Julian rarely, if ever, stayed out late. A small flicker of concern ignited in Alex's mind, but he pushed it down. Julian was an adult. He could take care of himself. Maybe he had decided to spend the night at the library or with a friend Alex didn't know he had. Alex went to sleep, assuming Julian would be back by morning, but Tuesday came and went, and there was still no sign of Julian. His side of the room remained eerily pristine. Now, Alex was genuinely worried. He hadn't seen Julian in 2 full days. He asked his friends and other people on their floor if they had seen him, but no one had. It seemed that Julian was just as invisible to everyone else on campus as he was to Alex. On Wednesday, Alex decided it was time to report him missing. He went to their resident advisor and explained the situation. The RA took it seriously and contacted campus police. An officer came to their room to ask Alex some questions. Had Julian seemed depressed? Did he have any enemies? Was he involved in any strange activities? Alex answered as best he could, but he realized with a sinking feeling how little he actually knew about the person he had lived with for months. The police began a formal investigation. They talked to Julian's professors. who confirmed he hadn't been to any of his classes since that Monday. They tried to contact his family, but the emergency contact information on his student file was a disconnected phone number and an address that led to a vacant lot. It was as if Julian had no connections to the world outside of the university. As the days turned into a week, the investigation stalled. There was no trace of Julian. His bank account hadn't been touched. His phone went straight to voicemail. He had vanished without a trace. Alex was left alone in the room, surrounded by the ghost of his roommate's presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Out of a mix of morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, Alex started going through Julian's belongings that he had left behind. There wasn't much, just some clothes in the closet and a few items in his desk drawer. Tucked away at the very back of the drawer beneath a stack of blank notebooks, Alex found a small leather-bound journal. He knew it was an invasion of privacy, but his desperation outweighed his guilt. He opened it. The journal was filled with Julian's neat, precise handwriting. But it wasn't a diary of daily events. It was filled with bizarre diagrams, complex mathematical equations Alex didn't recognize, and strange, rambling passages about theoretical physics, alternate dimensions, and something he called the fold. The writing was dense and obsessive, detailing what seemed to be a series of experiments. The last few entries were particularly disturbing. Julian wrote about being on the verge of a breakthrough. He described a ritual, a specific sequence of actions and thoughts that he believed could allow a person to step outside of their current reality. He wrote about a doorway that wasn't a physical door, but a mental one. The final entry, dated the Sunday night before he disappeared, was short and chilling. It read, "Tonight's the night. The calculations are perfect. I'm going to step through. I'm not sure if I can come back." Alex dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The cryptic clues suddenly formed a terrifying, impossible picture. Julian hadn't been abducted. He hadn't run away. He had, according to his own writings, attempted to travel to another dimension and had succeeded. It sounded insane, like something out of a science fiction novel. But what other explanation was there? It fit the bizarre, sterile nature of his disappearance perfectly. He showed the journal to the police. They were skeptical, to say the least. They treated it as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, suggesting that Julian had likely suffered a mental breakdown and was wandering somewhere, confused and alone. They filed it away as evidence, but Alex could tell they didn't believe a word of it. To them it was a sad story of mental illness, not a paranormal event. The university eventually cleared out Julian's belongings, and a new roommate was assigned to Alex. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Alex was haunted by what he had read. He couldn't look at the empty space where Julian's bed used to be without thinking of the fold and the doorway to another reality. He was left with a terrifying, unanswerable question. Did Julian simply suffer a psychotic break and wander off, his fate unknown? Or did he actually succeed? Did he find his doorway and step through to somewhere else, leaving his old life behind like a change of clothes? Alex will never know for sure. But sometimes, late at night when the dorm is quiet, he thinks he sees a flicker in the air in the corner where Julian's desk used to be, a brief shimmer, like heat haze, a distortion in reality, and he wonders if Julian is somewhere on the other side looking back. And with that, our journey through the shadowy corners of college life comes to an end for tonight. 4 stories of experiences that defy easy explanation, turning places of learning into arenas of fear. From a haunted dorm room to a silent stalker, a phantom knock to a roommate who vanished into the impossible, these accounts remind us that the transition into adulthood can sometimes come with terrifying, unforeseen challenges. The line between a stressful college experience and a true-life nightmare can be frighteningly thin. These stories are powerful because they feel real, because they tap into the vulnerability we all feel when we're in a new environment, away from the safety of home. Have you ever had an experience like this? Has a campus legend ever felt a little too real? I urge you to share your own scary college stories in the comments below. Reading through them, we can all see that we are not alone in these strange and unsettling encounters. Your story might be the one that makes someone else feel understood. If you found yourself captivated by these chilling tales, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next journey into the dark. We have many more true horror stories to share, sent in by people just like you from all over the world. Thank you for listening. And remember, as you go about your week, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened. Sleep well.